When my grandma passed away from COVID this past February, I had to go home to Arizona for the funeral. But I knew that it was more than just a trip back home. It was essentially to go home for a mission trip to share the gospel with my family. You see, when it comes to Chinese culture, it involves so much familial obligations, saving face, ruthless judgment, and emotional suppression. That's why, honestly, sharing the gospel with my family has always felt like an impossible task. Because every time that I've tried in the past, I would be met with discouragement and I would be immediately dismissed. So with that being said, one day my mom, uncle, and I were meeting around the table, planning for the funeral. And it came to our attention that our extended relatives had been gossiping about my family and harshly criticizing the decisions that we were making in regards to the funeral. Essentially, they were insinuating that there was a right way to go about things, and that in order to prove our love for my grandma, we had to spend an obscene amount of money on the funeral. And failure to do so would mean that my mom and uncle failed my grandma as her children. And as soon as this came to light, I saw my mom and my uncle just start to sob. And I had never seen them cry like that before. But just as quickly as they started crying, they just as quickly just stopped and returned to business as usual. So thankfully, God created this opportunity for me to talk to my uncle one-on-one. And in that conversation, I ended up asking him, "So, how do you feel about the decision?" And he said, "Well, I feel like we made the right decision." But it was in that moment that God brought to my realization that he didn't want to leave my uncle in his suppressed pain. So with all the courage that the Holy Spirit could give me, I ended up clarifying, and I asked him, "How do you feel emotionally? Because earlier I saw you and Mom cry, and it was specifically when our relatives mentioned that you were a bad son." He just started to weep very bitterly. I'd never ever seen him cry like this before. And I didn't know what to do. This is the first time. And so I just ended up praying in my head as my uncle was just sobbing. And I felt the Holy Spirit lead me to just lift up a hand and just place it on his back. And as I did that, I was breaking yet a family norm, because we're not a physical touch family. So I had my hand on his back, and I just felt like the Holy Spirit just give me these words of affirmation to speak to my uncle, to identify that what my relatives were saying about him, those were all lies. And rather, I can see all the ways that he's been a good son. And I recounted all of those ways. And so this tender, precious moment really became the catalyst for deeper conversations down the line. We would share about our traumatic childhood experiences for the first time with each other. And we talked about the pressures of living in a family like ours. And eventually we got to talk about our spiritual beliefs. He shared that he was an atheist, and I shared the gospel. God showed me that my uncle was much further along and open to it than I had assumed. So he ended up encouraging me to pray for him in my spare time, asking for God to give a sign, to show him that God is indeed real. God is indeed the God that I believe in. Despite the fear that I had, despite the obstacles, despite the cultural norms, God made a way where there was none. And because I was called to go, because of God's faithfulness, because of my decision to obey, God was, is, and always will be faithful. And because of all of that, my uncle is just that much closer to knowing Christ. My name is Melissa, and I'm called to go.